Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift slowly through some of the strangest and honestly most useless jobs that ever existed in the ancient world. So if you're lying in bed, lights dimmed, wondering why you spent another entire day scrolling through memes about medieval cats in armor, well, relax. You're among friends. Grab some water, maybe pull up that blanket a little tighter, and let's wander back in time to when people were actually paid, or at least fed, to do things so pointless that even their co-workers probably sighed whenever they showed up. And before we float too far into this bizarre little journey, take a moment, if you haven't already, to tap like on this video and subscribe. Only if you really want to, of course. It helps me keep whispering boring history into your ears at midnight. And let me know in the comments, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it right now for you? I always love scrolling through and seeing someone say, "It's 2 a.m. in Buenos Aires and I'm trying to pass out," while someone else casually mentions, "Good morning from Manila, listening while cooking breakfast." Time is weird, history is weirder, and humans have always been doing strange things with their lives. So, let's start with one of my favourites, the professional mourner. In the grand catalogue of useless jobs, few shine with the same dark sparkle as the professional mourner. Imagine being hired, literally paid, to cry at someone else's funeral. That was the gig. Loud, messy sobbing, wailing in rhythm, sometimes throwing yourself on the ground for dramatic effect. Because apparently nothing says we cared about him, quite like hiring 10 strangers to scream into the void at his burial. Ancient Egypt loved this. The wealthier the deceased, the bigger the wailing chorus. They even had specific women called kites, not the bird, though I suppose the sound effect is similar. Their job was to shriek and claw at their own hair, symbolising grief so deep it bordered on theatrical performance. And let's be honest, it was a performance. Rome. Oh, Rome absolutely jumped on that trend. Wealthy Romans practically competed in who could hire the noisiest professional criers. They wanted the neighbours to hear, "Wow, did you hear Gaius died? His funeral was practically an opera of despair. So impressive." Of course, most of these mourners had no idea who the dead person even was. But hey, a job's a job. Imagine clocking out after 8 hours of crying for strangers, heading home, and calmly making dinner like nothing happened. From a modern perspective, it's hard not to laugh. Grief outsourced, authentic sorrow, subcontracted. Families essentially said, "Look, we're too emotionally constipated to cry ourselves, but don't worry. We'll rent people who will." And yes, they were mostly women, because apparently men could conquer nations, but heaven forbid they sob in public. The knocker-up. Okay, now let's slide over to something that sounds a little different. And I promise, it's not what you think. The knocker-up was essentially a human alarm clock. Long before smartphones, long before even bedside alarm clocks, people in early modern Europe, especially in Britain, literally hired a guy with a stick to poke at their window until they woke up. Yes, that was the job. Poking. With sticks. Some knocker-ups used pea shooters, blowing dried peas at the glass panes of factory workers who had to be up at unholy hours. Others tapped endlessly on upper floor windows with bamboo rods. And the best part? They had to make sure you actually got up, which meant they kept tapping until you showed your annoyed face. Can you imagine how hated they must have been? Probably rank just below tax collectors and just above the neighbour's rooster. And the kicker, who woke up the knocker-up? Nobody ever really solved that paradox. They probably had wives who were sick of it. Or maybe just the existential dread of missing work was enough. But picture this. Entire communities depending on one slightly cranky guy with a stick, wandering around at 4 a.m. like some kind of human woodpecker. It was eventually replaced by alarm clocks, of course, which meant thousands of knocker-ups were instantly unemployed. Truly one of history's more useless professions. But hey, at least it beat crying for strangers. The groom of the stool. Yes, the groom of the stool. A job so infamously ridiculous that even saying the title feels like an insult. This was a highly prestigious court position in Tudor England. The duty? Helping the king go to the bathroom. Yes, helping, as in being in the room, handing him linen, monitoring his digestion, sometimes, apparently, wiping. And here's the kicker. It wasn't just some low-level servant. The groom of the stool was usually a nobleman, because the logic was, who else could be trusted with the king's most private business? Nothing says loyalty quite like that. Henry VIII had 4 different grooms of the stool during his reign. These men were technically among the closest advisors to the king because they spent more time with him in private than practically anyone else. And believe it or not, they gained enormous political power. Why? Because when you're literally wiping the royal backside, he tends to confide in you. It's absurd, of course. Imagine writing home to your parents. Great news, I got promoted. I'm now personally in charge of His Majesty's bowel movements. But here's the thing, it was considered an honour. Nobles would fight for the role. It gave them access to royal secrets, influence over appointments, and plenty of bribery opportunities. If you wanted a favour with the king, sometimes the fastest route was through the man holding the linen. So yes, one of history's most useless jobs was paradoxically one of the most powerful. And it lasted for centuries. Truly proof that humans can make anything political. The food taster. Now, you might be thinking, surely being a royal food taster wasn't useless. It saved lives, right? Except, not really. Royal courts throughout history, from ancient China to Renaissance France, employed people whose only job was to take the first bite of the king's meal. If they keeled over, well, congratulations. You just avoided being poisoned, at least until your next meal. But here's the flaw. Poison often isn't instant. Arsenic doesn't make you collapse face first into your soup after one spoonful. It takes hours, sometimes days, which means the food taster would survive dinner, and the king would still be doomed later. So in reality, the food taster's job was more about giving the illusion of safety than actually providing it. It reassured paranoid rulers, see? Someone else ate the stew first? You're fine. And then they happily tucked in, completely missing the point that subtle toxins don't care about such theatrics. Also, can we talk about the taster's perspective? Every day, your job description was essentially, eat this, maybe die. I don't care how much they were paid, that's a terrible gig. And yet rulers kept hiring them, century after century, proving that paranoia trumps logic every single time. The human alarm sundial guy. Let's drift even further back to the ancients. Before knocker-ups, before even mechanical clocks, some cultures had the human sundial announcer. Basically, a guy whose only job was to stand next to a sundial and shout out the time. Think about it. The sundial is already doing the job. It's literally showing the time. But apparently people wanted the extra step of someone loudly narrating it. It's the 3rd hour past sunrise. Yes, thank you, we can see the shadow. But okay, this was common in Roman forums and marketplaces. The sundial reader would declare hours for public events, legal proceedings, or just to remind everyone when lunch was. Which sounds fine, until you remember that sundials don't work in cloudy weather, at night, or indoors. So the job was basically seasonal, unreliable, and dependent on not having a cloud in the sky. It's one of those jobs that existed purely because people like outsourcing even the simplest mental tasks. Why think when you can pay a guy to shout at you? And those are just the first few entries on our very long, very sleepy list. From criers who didn't care, to stool grooms with suspicious levels of ambition, to men who poked windows for a living. Human history is absolutely packed with roles that make you wonder how entire civilizations didn't just collapse under the weight of their own inefficiency. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. There are many more to come. So let's drift onward, softly, to another questionable occupation. So, where were we? Ah yes, somewhere between men shouting at sundials and nobles fighting for the honour of monitoring royal digestion, which honestly feels like exactly the right headspace for a bedtime story. Now, let's glide into some even stranger roles. The kinds of jobs that, if you told someone about them at a party today, they would slowly back away, nodding politely and then block your number. The sin eater. Imagine this. You're dead. Well, you're not. But let's just say someone else is. A villager, lying stiff in their bed, and the family doesn't want that soul wandering around burdened by unconfessed sins. So what do? They call in a sin eater. This was a real job in parts of England and Wales all the way into the 19th century. The sin eater would show up, sit by the corpse, and literally eat bread and drink ale placed on the dead body. The belief was that by consuming this food, they were absorbing the dead person's sins, transferring all that guilt into their own body, which sounds disgusting, if we're being honest. Did it actually work? Of course not. But the families felt comforted. Don't worry, Uncle Harold's eternal soul is fine. We gave his sins to Dave the Sin Eater, who will now walk around like a walking landfill of everyone else's moral failures. Naturally, sin eaters were social outcasts. Nobody wanted to sit next to the guy at the tavern who supposedly contained the wrath of 20 different villagers. People believe they became spiritually toxic. But hey, someone had to do it, and bread is bread. It was a job that existed only because of superstition and fear. Utterly useless in any measurable sense, but deeply human. People outsourcing their afterlife anxieties to the village weirdo, and of course, they were paid poorly. Because nothing says, thank you for carrying our eternal sins like half a stale loaf. The gong farmer. If you thought the groom of the stool was bad, wait until you meet his distant, smellier cousin, the gong farmer. This was the job title in Tudor England for the poor souls who emptied cesspits and latrines. Their shift began at night, because the smell was too unbearable in the day. They climbed down into waist-deep sludge with buckets, shoveling it out into carts. And they were legally required to live on the edge of town because nobody wanted to live near them. You're probably thinking gross, but not entirely useless. Someone had to do it right. But here's the thing. Most of the time, gong farmers just moved the waste slightly out of town and dumped it. So instead of solving the sanitation problem, they just relocated it. Imagine if your garbage man picked up your trash and then politely deposited it in your neighbour's yard. So while technically useful, the system was laughably flawed. Whole rivers became cesspools, outbreaks of plague were happily fueled, and the poor gong farmers, despite doing society's dirtiest work, were treated like human lepers. If anything, the job made things worse, which qualifies it nicely for our list of useless. Court dwarfs and ornaments. Royal courts throughout Europe, but especially Renaissance and Baroque courts, had a habit of keeping ornamental people. That's the polite way of saying they employed dwarfs, jesters, and other oddities not for their skills, but for decoration. Kings and queens liked surrounding themselves with people who looked unusual, because apparently giant gold-plated thrones weren't enough to impress their guests. Some of these ornaments were treated well, dressed in fine clothes, and given positions of trust. Others were simply paraded around as curiosities. The Habsburgs in Spain, for instance, practically collected court dwarves like trading cards. Velázquez even painted them. Some portraits are haunting because you can tell the subject had more dignity than the role ever allowed. Was the job useful? Numbered existed entirely to stroke royal egos and entertain spoiled elites. Imagine being hired not for what you could do, but for simply existing in a body that amused someone with a crown. A tragically pointless job, and a reminder of just how cruel aristocratic boredom could be. The leech collector. Now let's wade, literally, into something more slimy. In medieval medicine, leeches were considered the cure for, well, everything. Headache, leech. Fever, leech. Probably stubbed your toe, slap a leech on it. Which meant there was an entire class of workers whose job was to collect leeches from ponds and marshes. How did they do it? by wading in barefoot and letting the leeches attach to their legs. Then they'd peel them off, toss them in a bucket and repeat until their blood supply was basically a group project. Again, not entirely useless, except that the medical practice itself was. Bloodletting rarely cured anything. Most of the time it weakened the patient further. So the entire industry of leech collecting was propping up a medical system that barely worked, and the collectors themselves, they often suffered anemia, infections and long-term illness. All so wealthy doctors could look wise while applying wiggly parasites to royal foreheads. Imagine being bled half to death so that someone else could get bled half to death more professionally. Truly, the circle of life. The royal wet nurse. Here's one that sounds sweet but quickly becomes absurd. The royal wet nurse. In many aristocratic households, especially in Europe, queens and noblewomen didn't breastfeed their own babies. Why? Because it was considered beneath them, or inconvenient, or they believed it would ruin their figures. Instead, they hired wet nurses, women, often peasants, whose sole job was to feed the baby from their own milk. Now, in theory, that sounds practical. Someone's got to feed the royal infant. But in practice, it was bizarre. Whole hierarchies of wet nurses formed, with salaries, prestige, and elaborate rules. Sometimes babies became more attached to their nurse than their actual mother, which created royal awkwardness. And of course, it meant the queen was symbolically distancing herself from her own child from day one, which may explain why so many royal families were emotionally colder than a stone cathedral in January. So yes, a job that existed purely because wealthy mothers couldn't be bothered. Necessary maybe, but socially ridiculous, and often useless in the sense that the actual mother was right there, choosing not to do the one thing biology designed her for. The royal whipping boy. Now this one almost sounds like a bad joke, but it's real. In some royal households, young princes were considered too sacred to be punished physically. You couldn't spank a future king after all, that would be inappropriate. So instead, they kept a whipping boy, another child, usually of noble birth, who was whipped whenever the prince misbehaved. The idea was that the prince would feel guilty watching his friend suffer and thus learn a lesson, which is insane. Imagine being a kid and realizing your entire role in life is to take beatings for someone else's mistakes. Talk about useless, and talk about emotionally confusing for everyone involved. Did it work? Probably not. Most princes grew up spoiled anyway. If anything, it taught them that other people would always pay for their actions, which to be fair is a pretty accurate lesson in monarchy. The human scapegoat. While we're on punishment, let's slide back even further to ancient rituals. Some cultures literally appointed people as ritual scapegoats, humans burdened with the sins of the community, then expelled, beaten, or even sacrificed. The word scapegoat comes from the Hebrew ritual of sending a goat into the wilderness carrying the people's sins, but in practice, humans often got that role too. Imagine drawing the short straw and realizing, congratulations, you're now the symbolic garbage bin for everyone else's bad behavior. Of course, it didn't actually purify anyone, it just reassured them. Another useless job, fueled entirely by superstition and tragically paid for in bruises and exile, the oracular chicken watcher. And finally, for this part, let's land softly in Rome again. The Romans loved omens. They believed the gods revealed their will in everything from lightning strikes to bird guts. One particularly useless job was that of the Polarius, the guy who looked after sacred chickens. Yes, chickens. Before battles, generals would consult the chickens. If the birds ate their grain eagerly, it meant the gods favoured the campaign. If the chickens refused to eat, well, bad omen. Cancel the invasion. The Polarius's entire job was to watch chickens eat and interpret it as divine communication, which was basically guesswork wrapped in feathers. There's even a famous story. Before a naval battle, the chickens wouldn't eat. The general, annoyed, supposedly tossed them overboard, saying, If they won't eat, let them drink. Spoiler, he lost the battle. So yes, men went to war, empires rose and fell, and somewhere in the middle of it, someone was literally employed to monitor poultry appetite. A job both useless and strangely charming. So there we have it. Sin-eaters, gong farmers, whipping boys, chicken whisperers. The parade of human absurdity continues, and we're still only scratching the surface. History is full of people who devoted their entire lives to tasks that now feel laughably pointless. But that's the beauty of it. Every strange, useless job tells us something about the fears, beliefs, and insecurities of the time. Fear of sin, fear of dirt, fear of punishing a prince, fear of chickens skipping lunch. So we've already wandered past crying strangers, stool grooms, leech wranglers, and sacred chickens who somehow decided the fate of empires. And yet, the parade of absurdity keeps marching on, because humans, bless us, will always find a way to turn complete nonsense into gainful employment. Let's glide now into a few more of those "how was this ever considered a job" professions, the court food sculptor. If you thought being a royal chef was stressful, try being the guy who shaped butter into swans. Yes, food sculptors. Throughout Renaissance Europe, courts loved edible displays. Whole animals roasted and reassembled, marzipan castles, butter statues, sugar figurines the size of toddlers. There were people whose only responsibility was to carve food into impressive but completely inedible shapes. The more useless, the better. Banquets became competitions. Who could afford the most ridiculous centerpiece? Imagine spending weeks carving a giant sugar fortress, only for it to be admired briefly, then tossed aside when the wine kicked in. It didn't feed anyone, it didn't last, but it showed status, which of course was the entire point. You weren't paying the sculptor to make art. You were paying him to prove you could waste sugar, which at the time was worth more than gold. So yes, royal food sculptor, an occupation equal parts artist and disposable party trick. Useless for nourishment, but very effective at flexing. The bed warmer. Now this one actually sounds kind of nice. Medieval and early modern elites sometimes employed servants as human bed warmers. Their job? To crawl into the Lord's cold sheets before bedtime and warm them up with their own body heat. Alternatively, they'd carry pans of hot coals between the sheets. Either way, someone's entire livelihood was based on making sure a duke didn't have to shiver for 3 minutes before falling asleep. Was it necessary? Not really. People managed without. But for nobles, apparently enduring a cold bed was a horror too great to face. Of course, there were risks. The coal pan method sometimes set the bed on fire. The human method, well, you were basically a living electric blanket, which, if we're being honest, is not exactly a skill. Still, people were paid for it. Some even held the job for years. Imagine introducing yourself. I'm the personal bed warmer for his lordship. My qualifications? I run hot. The alchemist for hire. Now let's talk about alchemists, or more accurately, professional dream sellers. For centuries, nobles and kings hired alchemists to sit in their courts, mix bubbling potions, and promise that one day they'd turn lead into gold. Spoiler, they never did. Kings poured fortunes into these men, convinced the secret of endless wealth was just one experiment away. And the alchemists were clever. They kept hope alive by staging proofs. Tiny demonstrations where something shiny appeared at the bottom of a flask, usually thanks to sleight of hand. And the ruler would sigh with relief, thinking, "Ah, yes, any day now I'll be richer than rich." In truth, alchemists were part scientist, part con artist, part court jester with glassware. Their real talent was in never actually succeeding, but convincing their employers not to fire them. So, centuries of failed experiments later, what did alchemy produce? Some decent chemistry notes eventually, but mostly wasted money, disappointed kings and men in robes muttering Latin while stirring suspicious liquids. As useless jobs go, alchemist for hire is near the top. The corpse wax collector. This one takes us to the strange world of 18th century burial customs. Ever heard of grave wax? Sometimes, under certain conditions, human fat in buried bodies turns into a soap-like substance called a depulcher. Creepy, yes. Well, there were people who collected it. They scraped it from corpses and sold it for use in candles or ointments, which is about as unnecessary as it sounds. Regular wax existed. Beeswax was right there. But humans being humans, we decided corpse wax had special properties. Collectors prowled cemeteries, digging up bodies, harvesting the wax and hawking it to gullible customers. A grotesque job that solved no problem, served no real purpose, and probably smelled horrendous. Useless, disturbing, and yet, for a time, profitable. Proof that you can literally monetize anything, even corpse goo, the herb strewer. Back to something gentler, but still pointless, the royal herb strewer. In the Tudor and Stuart courts of England, women were employed to scatter flowers and herbs along the floors of palaces. Why? To make things smell nicer. Or at least to cover up the stench of unwashed bodies and chamber pots. They would strew lavender, rosemary and petals in corridors, making the air more pleasant when courtiers walked by. It was essentially the human version of an air freshener. Did it actually purify the air? Number? Did it solve the root problem? Hygiene? Absolutely not. But it looked and smelled pretty. So, someone got paid to spend their days walking around with a basket of flowers, scattering them like confetti. A soothing image? Yes. But ultimately useless. A perfumed band-aid on a festering palace. The Royal Nipple Inspector. Yes, this was real. In ancient China, when a woman was chosen to become a wet nurse for the imperial household, her body was inspected in absurd detail. Officials literally examined her breasts to ensure she was suitable. Which means someone's entire job was inspecting nipples for the emperor's HR department. This was considered important work. The health of the heir, after all, depended on a good wet nurse. But think about it. The job itself didn't involve feeding the baby, or raising the child, or even picking the nurse. Just inspecting anatomy. It's one of those roles that exists only because bureaucracy loves to invent busy work. A whole position created out of something that could have been handled with common sense. The epitome of useless. The feudal falcon feeder. Falconry was a huge status symbol in the Middle Ages. Kings and nobles loved showing off their hunting birds, which meant they also needed people whose entire lives revolved around feeding, cleaning, and pampering these raptors. Now, caring for animals isn't useless, of course. But in this case, the falcon feeder wasn't a trainer or a hunter, just a caretaker of birds who were rarely even flown. Some courts had dozens of falcons that never left their perches. They were basically feathered jewellery. So the falcon feeder's job was to babysit luxury pets, day in, day out, feeding meat to birds that did nothing but sit and look intimidating. In other words, glorified poultry management. Not exactly earth-shattering work. The lector-slave of Pompeii. This one is quietly sad. In wealthy Roman households, there were slaves whose only duty was to read aloud to their masters during meals. These lectors recited poetry, philosophy, or history while the family dined. Why useless? Because half the time nobody listened. The masters were too busy gossiping or burping into their wine cups. The lector was essentially background noise. The ancient equivalent of turning on a podcast you don't really care about. It shows how wealth can twist even reading into drudgery. Imagine spending your life reciting Cicero to people who never even looked up from their olives. Useless not because reading isn't valuable, but because the context stripped it of all purpose. The court beard keeper. Yes, there were beard keepers. Some nobles and kings considered their beards so sacred, so important to their image, that they hired someone just to tend them. Combing, oiling, perfuming, occasionally braiding. Again, not useless in the literal sense. Grooming matters. But when your entire job is one man's beard, that's thin. You weren't a barber, you weren't a stylist, you were the custodian of a single patch of hair. It's like being employed as official left shoe polisher, specialised to the point of absurdity. Another job that screams, we've officially run out of things to do with our servants. The turnspit dog keeper. And finally, let's meet the man whose job was managing dogs that turned meat. In medieval kitchens, before rotisseries were automated, dogs were placed in little hamster wheel-like contraptions. As they ran, the wheel turned to spit over the fire. Whole breeds called turnspit dogs were developed for this. And yes, there were people whose sole occupation was to look after these dogs, training them to run in the wheel, swapping them out when they got tired, and keeping them alive just long enough to be replaced. The dogs themselves were miserable, often mistreated, and the job of their keeper, pointless in the long term since technology eventually made it obsolete. It's one of those roles that makes you wonder, who was more unfortunate, the dog in the wheel or the man paid to supervise him? So, to recap part 3, butter swans, bed-warming peasants, fake gold makers, corpse wax scrapers, nipple inspectors, and wheel dogs. All united by one theme. Humans will hire literally anyone for anything if it makes them feel more comfortable, more powerful, or more important. And somehow, these jobs lasted. Some for centuries, some evolving into slightly less absurd versions. But at their core, they remain monuments to wasted effort and misplaced priorities. We're still not done though. Oh no. There are plenty more useless roles to snooze through, from people who did nothing but hold torches, to ceremonial umbrella bearers, to astrologers who couldn't predict their own deaths. So let's gently roll into yet another lineup of history's most baffling careers. By now you might be wondering, how many of these jobs can there possibly be? And the answer is, more than you'd think. Because as long as humans have had hierarchies, wealth, and boredom, we've been inventing tasks just to fill space. Some jobs existed for ceremonial reasons, some for ego stroking, some just because someone powerful woke up one morning and decided, I'd like a man to hold this object for me all day. So let's shuffle along into another round of utterly baffling employment. The royal torchbearer, picture this. You're at a medieval feast. Long hall tapestries, roasted boars, drunk nobles shouting about hunting, but it's dark. No electric bulbs, just firelight. So naturally they needed torches, and naturally someone had to hold those torches. Enter the royal torchbearer. This person's entire job was standing around holding a flaming stick, sometimes for hours, sometimes following a king or queen down long corridors just to illuminate their steps. You weren't expected to say anything. You weren't expected to think. Just hold the torch and try not to set your boss on fire. Useless? Pretty much. Candelabras and mounted sconces already existed. They could have just stuck the torch in the wall and moved on. But no, it had to be personal. Because apparently light doesn't count unless it's being hand-delivered by someone with a title. It's another reminder of how much of history was about appearances. Having servants whose jobs were absurdly narrow was a way to show wealth. You were so rich, you could afford to pay a human lamp, the royal umbrella bearer. Not to be outdone by fire, let's look at shade. In many Asian and Middle Eastern courts, there was a ceremonial role, the umbrella bearer. Their job was exactly what it sounds like, following the king around with a parasol, indoors, outdoors, sometimes even when it wasn't sunny. Because the umbrella was not just practical, it was symbolic. It showed divine protection, prestige, and status. Of course you can guess how useful it was. The king could have carried his own parasol, or just stayed in the shade. But that wasn't the point. The umbrella bearer wasn't protecting him from sunburn. They were protecting his ego, and often the position was ridiculously prestigious. Some umbrella bearers were considered close attendants, trusted with secrets, treated as minor nobles, all for holding a stick with fabric on top. It's hard not to laugh. Imagine explaining to your grandkids, Yes, children, I was the great umbrella bearer of the Sultan. Without me, he would have had to squint slightly. The court astrologer. Now, I can already hear someone objecting. Astrology wasn't considered useless back then. True. But in hindsight, let's be honest, pretty useless. For centuries, kings and queens made massive decisions, wars, marriages, coronations, based on the ramblings of court astrologers. These were men who stared at the sky, charted the stars, and confidently declared, "Yes, your majesty, Mercury is in a cranky mood, so definitely invade France tomorrow." The tragic thing is, rulers believed them. Policies were delayed, treaties signed, babies conceived, all because someone with a beard and a star map said so. And when predictions went wrong, which they often did, well, they usually blamed the interpretation, not the system. It's easy to mock, but the damage was real. Whole kingdoms suffered because leaders outsourced strategy to stargazers, which, in terms of useless jobs, is about as high stakes as it gets. Imagine being the advisor whose main qualification is reading constellations like horoscopes in a tabloid, and yet the job thrived, because nothing flatters the human mind like pretending the universe is all about you. The official royal sleeper. This one sounds like a dream job, literally. Some monarchs, especially in the Ottoman and Mughal courts, kept people whose job was simply to sleep near them. Yes, sleep. Their presence was supposed to guard the ruler against bad spirits, nightmares, or assassination attempts. The idea being, if something sinister crept in at night, the sleeper would absorb it first, which is ridiculous. How effective could someone be at protection if they were unconscious? But superstition made it seem vital. Rulers often had whole teams of sleeping companions dozing nearby. Human dream catchers, basically. Its uselessness on two levels. One, it didn't actually ward off spirits. Two, if assassins really showed up, you'd have a half-asleep servant as your defense line. Hardly reassuring. But hey, for the sleepers themselves, it wasn't the worst gig. Paid to nap in a fancy palace, there are worse ways to exist. The wine taster. Now, you might think this sounds fun, drinking wine all day, who wouldn't? But let's look closely. Royal courts employed official wine tasters, separate from food tasters. Their duty wasn't only to test for poison, but to check quality. Yes, this vintage is acceptable for His Majesty, which, let's be honest, was basically an excuse to drink at work. Was it useful? Barely. Most kings weren't going to notice if the vintage was slightly off, and the poison detection problem was the same as with food. Delayed toxins made the whole system pointless. So you had men sipping expensive wines, pretending to be connoisseurs, when in reality their role was ceremonial. It was less about protecting the king, more about maintaining the illusion that he deserved only the best. A liquid ego massage. And of course, plenty of wine tasters ended up alcoholics, because if your entire career is taste every glass before the king drinks it, well, you're not spitting it out. The human scarecrow. We've all seen scarecrows in fields, but in some parts of medieval Europe, before stuffed dummies became common, actual humans were hired to stand in fields and wave their arms at birds. All day, that was the job. Stand in one spot, wave occasionally, scare the crows. It was usually given to children, the elderly or the very poor, and the worst part? Birds adapt. After a few days, the crows figured out that the scarecrow was just a tired guy half dozing in the wheat. Useless. Eventually, people realized stuffed dummies with old clothes worked just as well, and didn't need lunch breaks, which meant hundreds of living scarecrows were instantly out of work. It's one of the clearest examples of how human labor has often been wasted on tasks that an inanimate object could do better, and yet for centuries it was a legitimate job. Stand in a field, flap, collect a tiny wage. The candle snuffer. This one is both quaint and absurd. In big palaces filled with hundreds of candles, there were servants whose entire occupation was putting them out at night. Not lighting them, not arranging them, just snuffing them, one by one. You can picture it. A servant wandering through endless corridors carrying a little metal cone on a stick, methodically extinguishing flames, for hours. And in some cases there were multiple snuffers, because one person couldn't finish the job before dawn. Now, candles were necessary. But did you really need someone with a full-time position as a snuffer? Hardly. It was another case of palace bloat. So many servants that they had to invent hyper-specific duties to keep everyone occupied. It's the kind of uselessness that only exists when wealth is so extreme. Labour can be squandered like candle smoke. The town crier. Not useless in concept, but let's examine it. The town crier was employed to shout out news, laws and announcements in marketplaces, which made sense when literacy was low. But even after printing presses spread, town criers kept shouting, hear ye, a new edict." Meanwhile, pamphlets were already circulating with the same news, and people were beginning to ignore the man with the bell. By the 18th century, the role was more ceremonial than necessary. A shouting relic. Sometimes they even announced things everyone already knew. Imagine someone being paid to stand in your neighbourhood and yell, "The sun has risen!" It is Tuesday. At that point, the job wasn't about communication. It was tradition, an empty echo of a once useful role, which in our category of useless jobs fits perfectly. The court jesters, double jesters themselves weren't useless. They entertained, provided satire, sometimes even offered political advice disguised as jokes. But some courts actually employed jester doubles. Why? Because one jester wasn't enough. The double's role was to imitate the main jester, copy his antics, and basically act as a backup clown. It was meta-entertainment, a parody of a parody, and it added very little except confusion. Nobles laughed because it was absurd, not because it was funny, which makes it, in the purest sense, useless. Imagine being hired to copy someone else's jokes, knowing your entire career is just an echo. Truly a thankless profession. The chair tester. And finally, one more for this part, the royal chair tester. Before King sat down, someone else sometimes tested the chair, to check for comfort, number to check for traps, hidden blades, collapsing seats, or even poisoned cushions, because apparently assassins had a flair for upholstery. So a servant would dutifully plop down, wiggle a bit, and announce, "Safe, Your Majesty." And the king would sit. Did this prevent assassinations? Not really. Poisoned cushions were more fantasy than reality. But paranoia demanded ceremony, and so people spent entire careers as glorified seat warmers. It's the perfect note to end this part on. Humans so anxious that they literally hired people to sit in chairs for them. At this point you might be wondering, surely we've scraped the bottom of the historical employment barrel. We've had men holding torches, sleeping for kings, and literally waving at birds. But no, history always finds ways to surprise us. There's still a whole grab bag of peculiar, ceremonial, and utterly pointless roles to wander through. So let's dim the lantern a bit further and float into another batch of careers that really make you question how our ancestors ever got anything done. The court listener. Yes, this was a real job. Some monarchs, particularly paranoid ones, kept servants known as listeners. Their role? To stand quietly in corners during court events and literally listen. Not to participate, not to report in detail, just to hover silently, ears open, as human tape recorders. If anyone muttered something suspicious, the listener might pass it on. Now, was it effective? Hardly. First, everyone knew they were there. If you're plotting treason, you're not going to whisper it next to the royal listener. Second, their reports were often vague. Someone mumbled something near the banquet table. Thanks, very helpful. It was paranoia disguised as employment. A job that existed not because it worked, but because rulers liked the illusion of control. The listeners themselves, often feared, often hated, and usually ignored. Their lives were basically one long, awkward silence. the royal food chewer. This one sounds almost too absurd, but yes, food chewers existed. In certain courts, especially for elderly or sick monarchs, servants were hired to pre-chew food before handing it over. The idea was to soften it, make it easier to swallow and prevent choking. Think of it as being a human blender. Needless to say, it was humiliating and not particularly useful. Kings could have had their food mashed or pureed by other means. But for some reason, chewed by a servant's mouth was considered acceptable. Imagine sitting at a banquet watching the royal food chewer diligently work through a leg of mutton, then delicately pass it to the king. Appetite ruined. It's one of those jobs that makes you grateful for modern appliances and dental hygiene. The ceremonial guard who never fought. Palaces around the world loved ceremonial guards, the kind who stood in elaborate uniforms carrying weapons they were never expected to use. Some were essentially human statues, forbidden to move, speak or react, no matter what happened around them, which, in terms of actual protection, is useless. If assassins stormed in, the guard's job was more performance art than defense. It wasn't about security, it was about image. The uniform, the posture, the presence, a reminder of royal grandeur, which is fine, but not exactly a job in the functional sense. You were less a soldier, more a prop. And yes, they still exist today in places like Buckingham Palace. Tourists snap photos, guards stand motionless. The tradition continues, beautifully useless, the feather plucker. Let's step into medieval kitchens again. Feathers were a nuisance in cooking, chickens, geese, pheasants. Someone had to pluck them before roasting. So naturally, in large estates, this became a specialised role. The feather plucker. It wasn't cooking, it wasn't serving, it wasn't farming. Just hours of pulling feathers out of dead birds. Tedious, messy, and low prestige. And here's the kicker. Many kitchens had multiple feather pluckers, working full-time, which makes you wonder just how many birds they were eating daily. Spoiler, a lot. It was useful in the narrower sense. Someone had to do it. But useless in the grand picture. A hyper-specialised job born from the inefficiency of giant households. Today machines handle it. Back then, entire lives were devoted to poultry undressing. The ceremonial clock watcher. Before mechanical accuracy was universal, some courts actually paid people to stand by clocks and announce the time, not unlike the sundial shouter we already met. And the difference here? These were purely ceremonial roles. The king had a clock in his chamber, but rather than look at it, he preferred having someone declare, "It is now the 3rd hour past noon, sire." In some places it was done hourly, every hour like a living cuckoo clock. Imagine the poor servant sneaking into the royal chamber at night just to whisper, "It's midnight." The job contributed nothing. Everyone could see the clock, but the presence of a clock watcher reinforced the king's superiority. Even time itself had to be announced to him. The shoe remover. Certain Asian courts employed servants whose only task was removing royal shoes. That's it. No washing, no polishing. Just kneeling down and slipping them off when the king entered a room. You might think, surely anyone nearby could have done that. But no. Protocol demanded specialists. Which meant, if you were unlucky enough, your entire career might consist of being the royal shoe remover. Is one of those jobs so absurdly narrow that it collapses under its own uselessness. And yet, it carried ceremonial weight. Because hierarchy loves to create micro-roles, just to remind everyone of their place. The candle carrier. We already had the candle snuffer. Now meet the candle carrier. At certain ceremonies, someone's whole purpose was walking in front of the king holding a single lit candle. Not for light, not for warmth, but as a symbol of divine presence. The candle could have been set on a table, or held by anyone. But no, there had to be an official candle carrier. Sometimes multiple carriers, in solemn processions, all carefully balancing wax tapers. It was less about function, more about theatre, and like most ceremonial theatre, it quickly became empty ritual. Which lands it squarely in our useless jobs catalogue, the wig powderer, the 18th century. A time when aristocrats wore wigs the size of small horses. Naturally, someone had to powder those wigs. This wasn't a barber, not a stylist. Just a servant with a puff, dousing lords and ladies in clouds of flour-like powder until their hair looked appropriately ghostly. It served little purpose beyond fashion. The powder didn't preserve the wig. It didn't clean it. It just turned everyone pale and dusty. And yet, wig powderers existed as a recognised role in grand households. It's one of those jobs that makes sense only in a world where appearance mattered more than practicality. A perfect storm of vanity and inefficiency. The toastmaster. Not the modern toastmaster who runs speeches at weddings. I'm talking about 17th and 18th century courts where a servant's role was literally to drink the first sip of wine, raise it, and shout the name of the person being honoured. The nobility didn't toast for themselves. They had someone do it for them, which makes the role feel not just useless, but actively redundant. You already have a wine taster. You already have a servant pouring. Now you need a man to say cheers on your behalf. It's ceremonial bloat at its finest. The professional laughter coach. In some Roman banquets, wealthy hosts employed laughers, people whose role was to laugh loudly at jokes, ensuring the atmosphere felt jovial. Later versions existed in Renaissance courts. Kings sometimes kept a laughter master who encouraged nobles to chuckle appropriately. Essentially, human laugh tracks. Were they useful? Barely. They didn't improve the humour, they just made sure nobody forgot to flatter the host with giggles. It's almost too modern, too familiar. A useless job that feels like a prototype for sitcom soundtracks. The staff of bells. Some monasteries and palaces employed bell ringers, not for church towers, but for tiny indoor signals. They walked around ringing handbells to remind people to pray, eat, or change clothes. Again, clocks existed. Ritual schedules existed. But apparently nothing beat a guy jingling bells down the corridor. Did people already know it was mealtime? Probably. But still, someone was paid to make sure they knew twice. Another entry in the "we had too many servants, so we invented micro-jobs" category. So in part 5, we've drifted through listeners. Food chewers, ceremonial guards, feather pluckers, clock watchers, shoe removers, wig powderers, toast shouters, fake laughers, and bell jinglers. Each one as redundant as the last. And yet, all of them were real. All of them existed because power structures love surrounding themselves with ritual and inefficiency. Each little job was another reminder that the rich and mighty didn't even need to remove their own shoes. There was a specialist for that. We're not finished though, not even close. Next, we'll meet people who warmed thrones, held towels, carried swords they never swung, and even served as living decorations at feasts. Because if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that when humans have power and money, they'll always find a way to hire someone for absolutely nothing. We've wandered through wig powderers, ceremonial candle carriers, and men who shouted the time even though clocks were right there. You'd think we've run out of useless professions, but history is generous. Every era, every palace, every noble household seemed to invent at least a few new ways to waste human potential. So let's dim the lights a little further and stroll into another set of baffling occupations. The throne warmer. Yes, this was real. In some courts, especially in Asia and the Middle East, there were servants whose only task was to sit on the king's throne before he arrived, just to warm it up. Think about that. The throne itself was already an oversized cushioned seat, but heaven forbid His Majesty should feel the chill of upholstery. So someone else took the awkward responsibility of pre-warming the royal backside. Was it useful? Of course not. But it symbolized loyalty, comfort, and, more importantly, excess. You knew you were rich when you didn't even have to sit in your own cold chair. And for the throne warmer, imagine the nerves. Sit too long and you risk overwarming. Sit too short and the king still complains. A career balanced entirely on the buttocks of monarchy. The royal towel holder bathing rituals were big deals in many cultures, but kings and nobles couldn't just grab a towel like the rest of us. Oh no! They had attendants whose full-time job was to hold towels, not wash them, not fold them, not even hand them out to multiple people. Just stand near the bath and hold a towel for the one person who mattered. Some courts elevated this into a symbolic role. The chief towel bearer could even gain status simply by being allowed so close to the royal nakedness, which is not exactly the kind of prestige most of us would want. Useless, absolutely. Any servant nearby could have held a towel, but tradition demanded a designated towel guy. Another notch in the long list of ceremonial inefficiencies. The living table ornament banquets have always been an excuse for showing off, but in some royal feasts, showing off went to bizarre extremes. Noble households sometimes employed servants to literally sit at the table, dressed in elaborate costumes acting as living statues. They weren't guests, they weren't staff, they were decorations. Imagine attending a feast and realizing half the people at the table weren't eating. They were just hired to look interesting. Painted, perfumed, occasionally covered in gold leaf like human centerpieces. The job required no skill except sitting very still, and maybe resisting the urge to scratch. Useful, not at all. But it made the host look wealthy enough to use humans as furniture, which tragically was the entire point. The court flatulist, aka the professional fart joker, this one is infamous. In medieval Ireland, there are records of entertainers known as flatulists, men who could control and perform with their, well, digestive talents. One performer named Roland the Farter was supposedly granted land in exchange for entertaining the king every Christmas with a dance, a jump, and one precisely timed fart. Yes, that was his act. Now, fart jokes are eternal. Humans have laughed at them for thousands of years, but employing someone professionally for it, that's another level of useless. It's the sort of role that tells you medieval courts had far too much time and wine. Still, Roland probably had more job satisfaction than some poor torchbearer. At least he got applause. The sword bearer. Many monarchs had ceremonial sword bearers. These attendants walked ahead of the king in processions, carrying a giant sword upright as a symbol of authority. Did they ever fight with it? Was it practical? Not really. It was pure display. The king had plenty of armed guards who could actually use weapons. The sword bearer was just a moving coat rack for steel. Some sword bearers became prestigious positions, bizarrely enough. Because proximity to the royal sword meant proximity to royal power, but in terms of real function, they were just holding. Another man in a parade carrying weight that served no purpose except symbolism. The flatterer-in-chief now. Let's talk about flattery. Every court had sycophants, but some rulers actually institutionalized it. They gave people official roles whose job was simply to compliment them. In certain Chinese and Persian courts, you could find officers of praise, tasked with reciting daily odes about the emperor's greatness. Imagine clocking in for work knowing your shift consisted of inventing synonyms for majestic. Did the ruler already know he was powerful? Yes. Did he need reassurance? Always. And so entire careers were spent doing nothing but glorified brown-nosing. It's hard to think of anything more useless than institutionalized flattery. And yet, it thrived. The footstool holder. Here's another gem of ceremonial absurdity. In some royal households, servants were employed to act as living footstools, literally kneeling down and letting the king or queen rest their feet on their backs. Sometimes it was symbolic, demonstrating absolute loyalty. Sometimes it was practical laziness. Either way, it was demeaning and ridiculous. The role required no skill, no training, just knees of steel. And yet, it existed for centuries, a living metaphor for monarchy. Humans reduced to furniture so someone else could feel taller. The professional beard puller. Yes, we're back to beards again. In some ancient rituals, grief was shown by tearing hair and pulling beards. But since not everyone wanted to do that themselves, professional beard pullers existed. They were hired to yank on mourners' beards during funerals, forcing them to appear more distraught. A kind of grief performance enhancer. Imagine being paid to walk around a funeral, tugging people's facial hair until they cried. Not exactly a noble calling, useless in every sense, except as social theatre. The page turner. In wealthy medieval households, nobles who dabbled in music sometimes required assistance with their instruments. For instance, lutes or harps came with sheet music, and since turning the page was apparently too much effort, they hired page turners. These servants sat by the musician and flipped the sheet at the right moment. That was it. Not reading, not playing, just flipping. Did it make sense in large performances? Maybe. But for a noble strumming alone in their chamber, it was absurd. Another hyper-specialised job created just to avoid lifting a finger. The spittoon cleaner chewing tobacco became fashionable in some royal courts, which meant spittoons, little vessels for expectorating, became fixtures, and naturally someone had to clean them. Yes, there were attendants whose only task was to carry and empty royal spittoons. A revolting job, entirely dependent on someone else's bad habit. It solved no broader problem, it added no value, it just kept the palace tidy while nobles spit like llamas. A career path so useless that it barely deserves the name. The court echo one of the stranger Roman traditions. Some banquets supposedly had echo slaves. Their task was to repeat back certain words said by guests, as if amplifying them. A living echo chamber. Why? Entertainment. Nobles found it funny, and perhaps a little flattering. It's not clear how widespread this was, but the idea itself, hiring someone to mimic your speech for amusement, captures the essence of uselessness. An entire job built on repetition, adding nothing, except maybe irritation. So in part 6 we've encountered throne warmers, towel holders, living table ornaments, fart specialists, sword bearers, professional flatterers, human footstools, beard yanks, page turners, spit bucket guys, and literal echoes, each more absurd than the last, and yet all of them were paid, recognised, even respected in some twisted way. Because that's the magic of power and tradition. It can transform nonsense into employment. But we're not done. Oh no, in the next stretch, we'll meet feather testers, official sneeze announcers, symbolic key keepers, and even entire careers dedicated to standing in silence. Because apparently, people really love hiring other people to do nothing. At this point you may be wondering, were there really this many pointless professions? And the answer is yes. Human creativity is endless when it comes to inventing tasks that look impressive, but achieve almost nothing. Every palace, every empire, every king with too much money and too little patience managed to employ people for jobs that now feel more like punchlines. So let's slide softly into another handful of utterly baffling careers. The feather tester. Among the stranger obsessions of medieval and early modern elites was bedding. Feather mattresses, feather pillows, feather bolsters. Nothing said luxury like sleeping on half a goose. Which meant, of course, someone had to test the feathers. Yes. Wealthy households employed servants whose job was to lie down, roll around, and give feedback on the softness of the bedding. Yes, my lord, these feathers feel sufficiently fluffy. The absurdity writes itself. The feather tester wasn't crafting the bed, wasn't even maintaining it, just testing it like some kind of medieval quality control specialist for comfort. And not comfort for themselves. Comfort for the noble who'd be using it later. It was a career built entirely on other people's laziness, because apparently checking your own mattress was too exhausting. The royal sneeze announcer. This one is equal parts funny and sad. In some royal courts, sneezes were considered omens or messages from the gods, which meant when the king sneezed, someone had to announce it to the court. Yes. There were attendants whose job was to loudly declare, "His Majesty has sneezed," so that everyone present could stop, bow, and say "bless you" in unison. It wasn't about health. It wasn't about etiquette. It was about turning a bodily reflex into theatre. A minor biological spasm elevated to state ritual. Was it useful? Not in the slightest. Did it make the sneezer feel important? Absolutely. Another case of monarchy transforming trivia into ceremony. The key keeper, who never used the keys. Palaces often had keepers of the keys. In theory, they held authority over certain chambers, gates, or treasures. In practice, many never touched the keys at all. Instead, the keys were symbolic, carried on a chain, displayed at ceremonies, handed dramatically to new rulers. The keeper's role was essentially to walk around jingling keys they never used. It was meant to signify trust and access. But in reality, guards and stewards did the actual locking and unlocking. The keeper just looked impressive, a walking metaphor rather than a active role. So yes, an entire career as a human keychain. The shadow follower. In some Eastern courts, especially in China and Japan, there are records of attendants known for their role of literally following the emperor's shadow. The job was simple. Wherever the ruler walked, they walked too, slightly behind and off to the side, ensuring the shadow was attended. Sometimes it had spiritual meaning, sometimes just ceremonial. But either way, the shadow itself received more service than most peasants. Did it matter? Not at all. The emperor's shadow would have been just fine on its own. But the presence of a shadow follower added mystique, as if even the intangible needed guarding. It's one of those jobs that sounds like parody, a life spent trailing behind someone's silhouette. The silence keeper. This one's quietly absurd. Certain royal courts had attendants called silence keepers. Their role was to maintain solemn quiet during rituals, meals, or prayers. How did they do that? By shushing people, literally walking around with an air of authority, glaring, and occasionally raising a finger to their lips. It was less about function and more about intimidation. Anyone could enforce silence. But creating an official role gave the impression that silence itself was a sacred duty. It's useless because it outsourced something everyone could have handled themselves, like inventing a job called official blinker to make sure people remember to blink. But hey, someone got paid to shush nobles, which must have been satisfying in its own way. The train holder. Not a train as in locomotives, the other kind of train. The long trailing fabric of royal gowns. Queens, empresses, and even kings in ceremonial robes often had yards of fabric dragging behind them. Naturally, they couldn't manage it themselves, so they had train holders, servants whose job was to walk a step behind and keep the cloth from snagging, tangling, or dragging in the mud. Necessary in the narrower sense, but ridiculous in the larger one. The train itself was a design choice. Deliberately impractical, a way of saying, I'm so powerful, I don't need to walk efficiently, which meant a whole human life could be dedicated to babysitting cloth. Useless, yes, but also a perfect metaphor for monarchy. Inefficiency turned into spectacle. The court yawner. Here's a truly strange one. Some sources suggest certain banquets and rituals employed yawning servants. Their job? To yawn deliberately, signalling when guests were allowed to leave without offending the host. It sounds silly, but think about the social awkwardness of leaving a feast too early. The yawn created plausible deniability. Ah, the servant yawned. Clearly the event is winding down. Useful? Barely. It's basically an ancient version of someone saying, well, it's getting late. But when formal etiquette was so stiff, apparently even yawns had to be regulated. And so, a career was born. Professional boredom, choreographed for aristocracy. The handholder. Yes, really. Some rulers kept attendants whose task was simply to hold their hand during long ceremonies or walks. Not out of affection, but stability. It wasn't a physician, not a guard, just a literal handholder. Someone to stand there, fingers laced, while the king stood on a balcony or endured a lengthy ritual. It was both infantilizing and theatrical, a display of intimacy, dependence, and authority, all in one strange gesture. And for the handholder, a lifetime of clammy palms. The napkin carrier banquets required table service, of course, but in some elite households there was a servant whose exclusive duty was carrying and presenting the master's napkin. Not multiple napkins, not general service, just one napkin for one person for one meal. It was ceremonial, yes, but also profoundly silly. A job stripped of all utility, reduced to the bare minimum of fabric delivery, the very essence of redundancy. The cough recorder. This one drifts into the absurd. Some paranoid rulers, particularly hypochondriacs, kept attendants whose task was to track their coughs, sneezes, or physical quirks. Every throat clearing was noted, sometimes even reported to physicians. The role existed purely to feed royal hypochondria, a useless job because the act of recording never improved health. But it reassured rulers that their every bodily twitch was under surveillance, a strange blend of paranoia, superstition, and bureaucracy, and a reminder that power often creates nonsense roles simply to soothe fragile egos. So in part 7 we've met feather testers, sneeze announcers, ceremonial key jinglers, shadow followers, silent shushers, train holders, yawning servants, hand holders, napkin carriers, and even cough recorders. Each one was real. Each one turned a trivial detail into a ceremony, and each one stands as proof that humans will pay others to handle even the tiniest inconveniences. But don't worry, the absurdity isn't over yet. Next, we'll wander through royal spit polishers, eyebrow pluckers, water tasters, and even entire roles dedicated to sitting near someone important, doing absolutely nothing. Because when it comes to useless jobs, history just keeps on giving. By now we've tiptoed through a whole parade of nonsense careers, sneeze announcers, shadow followers, footstools, towel holders, and men who literally got paid to yawn on cue. And yet, history is bottomless. Every palace had new layers of ceremonial clutter. Every monarch seemed determined to invent roles just to prove they had enough bodies to waste. So let's stretch out, relax, and wander through another lineup of wonderfully useless jobs. The royal spit polisher. Chewing and spitting were considered perfectly normal among elites in different eras. Tobacco, betel nut, or just random saliva deposits into ornate spittoons. And naturally, someone had to clean them. But some monarchs took it further. They had attendants whose role wasn't just emptying spittoons. It was polishing the actual spots where spit had landed. Floors, goblets, railings. Wherever it splattered, the spit polisher was there, cloth in hand. Imagine the indignity. A career based entirely on royal expectoration. And you had to be fast. No one wanted a visible glob sitting too long, which meant hovering, waiting, cloth ready, like some kind of saliva bodyguard. It was necessary only because aristocrats couldn't be bothered with manners, and so a pointless job was born, soaked in indignity. The eyebrow plucker cosmetics have always created jobs, but some crossed into the absurd. In certain royal courts, especially during Renaissance and Baroque times, attendants were employed solely to pluck noble eyebrows into fashionable shapes. This wasn't a barber, or even a general beautician, just a dedicated plucker. The nobles themselves wouldn't touch tweezers, far too undignified. Instead, they summoned a servant to lean in and fuss over a pair of eyebrows. Hours could be spent on this. Sometimes whole teams worked on one person's hair and brows simultaneously, like a pit crew for vanity. Useful? Not really. Did anyone's political power depend on brow shape? Hardly. But appearances mattered so much that useless grooming became full-time work, the royal water taster. We've had food tasters, we've had wine tasters, but yes, there were also water tasters. Their job, sip from the jug of water before the king drank it. Was it poisoned? Probably not. Poisoning the water supply would have been logistically ridiculous, but rulers still demanded the ritual. which meant someone spent their life sipping lukewarm water all day just in case. And here's the kicker. The same flaw as food tasters. Slow-acting poison wouldn't show up instantly, so the ritual was entirely useless, an empty reassurance. Imagine being the guy hired to drink plain water all day and knowing it meant nothing. A career that was both boring and pointless. The ceremonial sitter. In some Byzantine and Ottoman rituals, certain officials were appointed as ceremonial sitters. Their job? To sit on ornate chairs near the emperor, not speaking, not moving, just existing as symbols of stability. The logic was that their silent presence represented order and continuity, which is a fancy way of saying they sat there like expensive props. For the sitters, it was probably dull. Hours of stiff posture, no participation, no conversation, just sitting to prove you could sit in the presence of greatness. It's the definition of uselessness, doing nothing for symbolic reasons, in elaborate costumes. The door opener doors are simple. You walk up, you open them. Unless, of course, you're royalty, in which case someone else has to do it for you. Palaces often had attendants whose job was literally opening doors. They didn't guard them. They didn't control access. They just opened them when the king approached. Some of these positions were absurdly prestigious. Being close enough to the ruler to open his door was considered an honour, which is a reminder of how uselessness and status often walked hand in hand. Imagine dedicating your life to hinges and being respected for it. Truly a strange world. The fly chaser flies are annoying, but while the rest of us just swat them away, nobles hired humans as full-time fly chasers. Servants stood behind thrones or near dining tables, waving fans or cloths to keep insects at bay. Sometimes they even used elaborate golden fly whisks. Did it work? Barely. Flies still buzzed around, but the presence of a fly chaser showed the ruler was above such indignities. They would never lower themselves to wave their own hand. So someone else spent a lifetime swatting air. A job both exhausting and absurd. The pillow fluffer beds again. Nobles loved comfort, and comfort meant pillows, which meant fluffers. Servants whose entire duty was plumping cushions before and during rest. Not sewing, not cleaning, just plumping. Some were even required to adjust the pillows mid-sleep, sneaking in to rearrange them if the royal head shifted awkwardly. Imagine creeping into a room at 2 a.m. to give a pillow a gentle shake, then tiptoeing back out. It's ceremonial fuss disguised as service, pointless, but treated like science. The royal handkerchief holder. Much like towel holders, some rulers are designated handkerchief attendants. They carried embroidered cloths at all times, ready to offer one whenever the ruler sniffled, sweated, or needed to dab theatrically at their brow. And no, they weren't expected to wash them, just hold them, present them, and then pass them to laundry staff. Again, hyper-specialization at its finest. A job reduced to carrying squares of fabric for one person's nose. Useless in any broad sense, but prestigious in palace pecking orders. The whisperer. In some courts, particularly Renaissance Italy, nobles employed whisperers, attendants who repeated things quietly into their ears during meetings or ceremonies. Not because the nobles were deaf, just because they wanted someone to lean in dramatically and inform them, even if it was obvious. It created an air of mystery and authority. The noble looked important, being constantly whispered to. The whisperer himself? A glorified parrot, repeating what everyone already knew. Another job that produced no value, but endless theatrics. The torch snuggler. Yes, this one sounds weird, but bear with me. In certain cold European churches and palaces, large torches were mounted, and attendants were hired simply to stand near them so the flame didn't blow out. Their body acted as a shield against drafts. That was it. Their entire duty was being a human windbreak. It was exhausting, sweaty, and utterly useless once better torch holders were invented. but for centuries people stood guard over flames like loyal companions to firewood. The royal fingernail cutter. One of the more intimate roles, cutting the king's nails. Rulers apparently couldn't be trusted with scissors, so servants knelt down and clipped, filing the royal nails into neat shapes. It was treated with ceremony, sometimes involving multiple attendants. One to cut, one to hold the cuttings, one to dispose of them ritually. Because even fingernail clippings were considered politically significant. It's hard to think of a more useless overcomplication. A task any child could do, turned into state ritual with multiple salaries attached. So, in Part 8 we've had spit polishers, eyebrow pluckers, water tasters, ceremonial sitters, door openers, fly chasers, pillow fluffers, handkerchief holders, whisperers, torch snugglers, and nail clippers. Each one absurd, each one proof that monarchy turned trivia into theatre. And still, history hasn't run out. Next up, we'll wander through roles like royal stool watchers, toe washers, official gum chewers, beard sniffers, and yes, even servants who are paid just to stand around looking symmetrical. Because apparently nothing was too small to become somebody's career. We've wandered through spit polishers, towel holders, fart performers, shadow followers, and sneeze announcers. And you'd think by now we must have exhausted every useless career history has to offer. But of course, humans never disappoint. The deeper you dig, the more absurdity you find. So let's drift one last time through the strangeness of ceremonial overemployment, and then wrap things up with a quiet reflection. The stool watcher. Not to be confused with the groom of the stool, whose job was already bizarre. Stool watchers were attendants tasked with inspecting the royal bowel movements for signs of illness. Yes, entire careers were built on staring into commodes. Doctors claimed they could divine health from colour, texture, or other qualities, so stool watchers became important. But in practice, the role was mostly superstition wrapped in embarrassment. Imagine dedicating your life to analysing the king's bathroom output and not even being allowed to discuss it openly. Useful? Barely. Dignified? Not at all. The toe washer feet have always been ritual objects. In many religious and royal ceremonies, washing someone's feet was considered an act of humility or devotion, which meant attendants were employed just to wash toes, not whole baths, just feet. And while in religious contexts it carried meaning, in palaces it was often empty pomp. A man or woman kneeling to scrub royal toes while the court watched approvingly, as if hygiene itself became theatre, necessary, number, humiliating, usually. Another notch in the useless job catalogue. The gum chewer. Yes, in certain ancient courts, there were attendants employed to chew gum-like resins, like mastic, until they softened, then passed them to their rulers to freshen breath. Because apparently a king couldn't be bothered to chew. It was intimate, gross, and completely unnecessary. But like so many roles, it became status. If someone else chewed for you, you were clearly above the labour of mastication. A career path where your skill set was literally pre-chewing things for the boss. The beard sniffer. This one almost feels made up, but records suggest that in some Middle Eastern courts, attendants were tasked with ensuring the ruler's beard smelled fresh. Oils, perfumes, and incense were applied, but someone still had to lean in and sniff to check. Imagine standing in a court ceremony, leaning close to a bearded sultan and saying, "Yes, my lord, it smells excellent." That was the job. Useless because no one else dared say otherwise. If the beard smelled bad, nobody was going to complain. The sniffer existed only to flatter hygiene. The symmetry stander. Some courts, particularly in Renaissance Europe, had attendants employed to stand in pairs around thrones or corridors. Their only function, looking symmetrical. They weren't guards. They weren't advisors. They were props, placed to create pleasing visual balance during ceremonies. It was theatre taken to absurd extremes. humans as wallpaper, a career path with no purpose beyond geometry, the final drift. So here we are. We've travelled across centuries, through every palace and banquet hall, and discovered a zoo of uselessness. Professional criers, stool grooms, shadow followers, fart performers, fly chasers, sneeze announcers, spit polishers, toe washers, and beard sniffers. Each one a little window into how absurd human societies can be when wealth, paranoia, and ego combine. And yet, here's the thing. As useless as these jobs were, they all tell us something important. They weren't just about function. They were about status, symbolism, and fear. A king with a stool groom wasn't just being ridiculous. He was broadcasting trust, intimacy, and power. A noble with a food sculptor wasn't just wasting sugar. He was proving he could afford waste. Even the silliest jobs served as mirrors of the society around them. In that way, uselessness becomes oddly meaningful, because it shows us what people valued, or what they feared, or what they thought looked impressive. Whether it was keeping flies away, plucking eyebrows, or announcing sneezes, all of it was theatre. A never-ending performance of hierarchy. So the next time you feel like your job is pointless, maybe shuffling papers, maybe filling out forms nobody reads, just remember, at least you're not a professional stool watcher. At least you're not paid to follow someone's shadow. History has always been full of jobs more pointless than yours, and somehow those people still mattered, if only because they remind us of how strange humans can be. So with that thought, close your eyes. Let the absurdity drift away. From professional mourners to ceremonial napkin holders, the parade of useless jobs is over, for tonight at least.